Nobody believed a jar of dust could save a farm, but Margaret Whitfield had spent 40 years collecting it, one careful pinch at a time, from every failed field in 3 counties. And on the coldest morning of her granddaughter-in-law's life, it was all that was left to hold on to. They laughed at her at the feed store first, then at church. Then finally they laughed at the fence line, the way people do when they've already decided someone is finished and just want to watch it happen up close. Rosa Whitfield was 22 years old, 5 months a widow, raising a 6-year-old son alone on 60 acres of Nebraska dirt that hadn't grown a decent crop in 3 years. She was out in the north field at first light, kneeling in soil the color of ash, pressing small pinches of dark powder into the ground with her bare fingers, one seed hole at a time, while the men from the grain co-op leaned on the rails and shook their heads. They called it grave dirt. They called it a dead man's trick, though it was a dead woman's, and nobody bothered to correct themselves. Rosa's own father-in-law, Walter Whitfield, stood at that fence some mornings and told her plainly that she was burying her son's future in superstition and that the bank would take the farm in 90 days whether she prayed over it or not. But Rosa kept kneeling in the cold, working the jar into the earth handful by handful, because the note tucked inside it, written in her husband's grandmother's careful, spidery hand, had said only this: "When everything else has failed you, trust what you cannot see." To understand why a young widow would gamble 60 acres on a jar of dust, you have to understand what Rosa had already survived. You have to understand Colfax County in the autumn of 1948, when the drought that had cracked the plains for 3 summers straight showed no sign of breaking, when the topsoil lifted in the wind and buried fence posts to their crossbars, when families who had farmed the same ground for 2 generations packed their trucks in the night and drove west without saying goodbye to anyone. You have to understand that Rosa's husband, Daniel, had died that spring, not in some grand tragedy, but in the ordinary, brutal way farm men die. A tractor rollover on a slope he'd worked 100 times before. Gone before the doctor from town even arrived. He left behind Rosa, their son, Michael. 60 acres of dying soil and a debt to the First Colfax Bank that grew heavier every month like a stone tied around her ankle. Daniel's grandmother, Ada Whitfield, had died 2 winters before Rosa ever married into the family, but her presence still lingered in every corner of the old farmhouse, in the mason jars lined up along the root cellar shelves, each one labeled in faded ink with the year and field number, each one filled with a dark, unremarkable powder that looked to any ordinary eye like nothing more than burnt soil swept off a stovetop. The other farm wives had called Ada strange in her time. She kept no proper garden calendar. She planted by signs no almanac recognized, walking her rows at dusk, murmuring to the ground like it could hear her, like it was an old friend she checked in on. But her crops, when everyone else's failed, had a stubborn way of surviving. Her tomatoes ripened in droughts that killed her neighbor's corn outright. Her wheat stood gold and tall in seasons when the wind stripped every other field bare down to the clay. Rosa found the jars on a gray October afternoon while clearing out the cellar to make room for what she assumed would be a visit from the bank's inspectors. She had 90 days to prove the farm was worth keeping, or Walter would sell it out under her and Michael to cover debts Rosa hadn't even known existed until the funeral was barely over. Debts Daniel had quietly taken on the year before he died, hoping a good harvest would clear them before anyone had to know. She was reaching past a shelf of empty canning jars when her hand brushed a wooden box tucked into the darkest corner of the cellar, unlabeled, half buried under old feed sacks. Inside it were 7 mason jars of dark powder, and beneath them, folded twice, a letter addressed simply, "For whoever needs it most." Rosa sat on the cold cellar steps for a long while, the letter trembling slightly in her hands, reading Ada's words until she had them memorized.
The old woman explained nothing about what the powder was actually made from, only that it came from ash and bone meal and years of careful burning of the healthiest plant matter she could find, ground fine and blessed, in Ada's own words, with more patience than science ever taught anybody. The instructions on the back were simple, almost stubbornly so. Work a pinch into each seed hole, plant in the coldest week you can bear, and do not dig it up to check. Just wait. Trust the water when it comes, and trust the ground when it doesn't. Rosa knew almost nothing about farming beyond what she'd absorbed from the porch steps, watching Daniel work from a distance with a kind of loving curiosity that never quite turned into knowledge. She had grown up in town, the daughter of a school teacher, and had planned once, before she fell for a quiet farm boy at a county fair dance, to become a teacher herself, to have a life measured in chalk dust and report cards instead of weather and debt. Now she held 7 jars of ash and a dead woman's promise, and she felt something rise in her chest that wasn't quite hope. Hope felt too fragile a word for what she carried that afternoon. It was closer to defiance, a refusal to let the ground win without at least making it fight for the victory. The next morning, she carried the jars down to the north field, the 12 acres closest to the dry creek bed that Daniel had always called the tired ground, because nothing had grown well there in a decade, not since before his own father was young. It was cracked and pale, the kind of soil that crumbled to powder between your fingers and lifted away on the smallest wind. She knelt in the cold and worked the ash into the seed rows exactly as instructed, refusing to let herself think too hard about how it must look from the road, a young widow on her knees in frozen dirt, burying dust instead of seed corn, while her neighbors slowed their trucks to watch and shake their heads at one another. Word moved fast through Colfax County, the way it always does when someone is either failing spectacularly or succeeding in some way nobody can yet explain. By the second week, everyone at the co-op had an opinion, and most of them weren't kind. Walter Whitfield drove out on a Thursday, his old truck kicking up dust on the lane, and found Rosa still working the last of the 7 jars into the frozen ground. He didn't get out right away. He sat behind the wheel a long moment, watching his daughter-in-law kneel in the cold, and when he finally climbed down, his voice was tight with something caught between grief and anger. "Rosa, this has to stop. You're planting nothing. Ash and burnt bone won't grow a single thing, and somewhere inside you, you know that." Rosa didn't look up from the row. She was working. Ada left this for someone who needed it most. That's Walter. That's Michael. Walter's jaw worked like he was chewing on words too bitter to speak plainly. My mother was a good woman, but she believed things nobody could ever prove, and it cost her more than she'd admit. The bank doesn't care about her jars, Rosa. Mr. Pruitt is coming in 90 days, and if this field looks like nothing but blown dirt when he does, he'll call the note due, and there won't be a single thing I can do to stop him this time. Then let him see it, Rosa said, and her voice held steadier than she felt inside. Let him see everything I tried, at least. Walter stared at her a long moment, and in his eyes she saw not anger, but something far worse, the quiet collapse of a man who had already buried his hope for this farm alongside his son. He turned without another word and drove back toward town, and he did not return for nearly a month. The county agricultural agent, a precise, humorless man named Elliot Ferris, arrived the following week with a soil testing kit and a clipboard he carried like scripture. He knelt at the edge of the north field, examined a handful of Rosa's treated soil beneath a small magnifying lens, and delivered his verdict with the flat, practiced certainty of a man who had rarely been wrong in an official report. Mrs. Whitfield, this powder shows no measurable nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium content beyond what's naturally present in any ash. What you've done here is, agriculturally speaking, meaningless. Worse, this field has already lost nearly 40% of its topsoil to wind erosion over the last 3 seasons. Without proper cover cropping and contour plowing, you're looking at total crop failure by June, regardless of what's in those jars. Rosa listened to every word without flinching. My husband's grandmother grew wheat on this land that won a blue ribbon at the county fair 3 years running, she said quietly. Roses and record wheat aren't the same as 60 acres of dying topsoil, Mrs. Whitfield, Ferris replied, not unkindly, but with the weary patience of a man delivering bad news to someone he assumed wouldn't hear it anyway. He left, and Rosa stood at the edge of the field after his car had disappeared down the lane, and then she knelt again in the cold dirt and pressed her palm flat against the earth. It wasn't quite a prayer, but it was close enough to one that she didn't correct herself for calling it that, quietly in her own mind. Winter closed hard over Colfax County that year. The wind never seemed to stop, carrying grit that found its way into every seam of the old farmhouse, coating the windowsills each morning, working its way into Michael's small chest until his cough worried Rosa more than she ever let him see on her face. She spent the frozen months mending fences, patching the roof with whatever scrap tin she could scavenge, teaching Michael his letters by the stove at night with a piece of chalk and an old slate that had been Daniel's as a boy, and walking the north field most evenings just to look at it, though there was nothing yet to see but pale, cracked ground under a colder, paler sky. She told herself that if nothing came up by June, she would take Michael to her sister's place in Lincoln and let Walter do whatever he needed to do with the land. But some nights, standing at the edge of that silent field, with the wind cutting straight through her coat, she didn't believe she would actually leave. Not really. Something had taken root in her the day she found those jars in the cellar, something as stubborn and quiet as the dust itself. Christmas came and went with little more than a small tree Rosa and Michael cut from the windbreak at the edge of the property, and a modest dinner shared with Mrs. Alma Kowalski, a widow herself from the next farm over, who had brought ham and asked no questions about the jars, which Rosa found she was grateful for more than she could say. January brought the deepest cold of the year, cold enough that Rosa worried, in her most honest moments before sleep, whether anything at all could survive beneath that frozen ground, Ada's ash included. March brought the first real thaw, and with it, the first sign that Rosa's breath catch hard in her chest. Walking the field one gray, damp morning, she nearly missed it entirely. A faint green blur low against the pale soil, so small she assumed at first it was only a trick of the early light. She knelt and brushed the dirt back gently with trembling fingers, and there it was, a seedling, thin as a single hair, pale green, pushing its way up through soil that had grown nothing but weeds and cracked earth for 3 long years. By the end of that week, there were dozens more, and by the following week, hundreds, threading up through the tired ground in rows that Rosa hadn't even measured by string, only by feel and memory and hope.
Walter came back in April, and this time he didn't stay behind the wheel of his truck. He walked out into the field with his hat in his hands and stood beside her in silence, staring at the green haze spreading slowly across ground that had defeated him more times over the years than he cared to count aloud. "That's not possible," he said, so quietly it seemed meant only for himself. "This field hasn't held a stand like this since before Daniel was even born." Rosa said nothing at first. She only watched the wind move gently through the new growth, and for the first time since the funeral, she let herself cry without trying to stop it, not from grief this time, but from the almost unbearable weight of hope finally, cautiously returning to her chest.
By May, the North Field was a solid stand of young wheat, green and thick and already taller than anything else growing on the Whitfield land. Elliot Ferris returned, his clipboard heavier now with confusion than with certainty, and tested the soil again and found the impossible confirmed in his own careful numbers. Organic content nearly doubled from his October reading, moisture retention far beyond anything the surrounding fields could show. The once cracked and dying earth transformed into something dark and rich beneath the new roots. He stood at the fence a long while before he found the words to admit, quietly and a little unwillingly, that he had been wrong, and that he didn't fully understand how, and that maybe there were things about this particular stretch of land that no soil test could ever fully explain. Word spread through the county the way it always does, but this time it carried something other than mockery in it. Neighbors who had once laughed at the fence line began driving slowly past on the county road, craning their necks at the green field where there should have only been dust and disappointment. Tom Kessler, who ran the largest spread in the county and had circled Rosa's land with a buyer's eye for 2 years running, came by in June under the pretense of neighborly concern, offering to buy the farm outright before the bank could for what he called a generous price given the property's condition. Rosa listened politely, thanked him, and declined, and something in her voice must have carried more certainty than he expected, because he didn't come back a second time.
Mr. Pruitt from the bank arrived in late June, a full month before Walter's dreaded 90 days were even up, and when he saw the wheat standing tall and green gold under the early summer sun, stretching across ground the bank's own records listed as worthless, he folded the foreclosure paperwork back into his briefcase without a word, and told Rosa plainly and without embarrassment that a farm like this one didn't need saving from the bank, it needed protecting, and the bank would be glad to help her do it, on new and far gentler terms than before. The harvest that September was the finest Colfax County had seen in nearly a decade, and Rosa Whitfield stood at the edge of the North Field with her son's small hand held tightly in hers, watching neighbors who had once shaken their heads at her, now arriving quietly with their own worn jars and coffee tins, asking, humbly, hats in hand, if she might spare a little of Ada's ash for their own dying ground. Rosa gave freely of what remained, dividing careful pinches between calloused, waiting hands, because by then she understood at last what her husband's grandmother had always known and never fully explained, that some things the land needs cannot be measured on any clipboard, only offered patiently, faithfully, by someone willing to kneel in the dirt long after everyone else has already walked away and stopped believing. Michael grew up on that farm knowing the story by heart, the way children know the stories that shape them before they're even old enough to understand why. He would tell it himself one day to his own children, standing at the edge of a field that never again went back to dust, a field that fed the county through 2 more droughts in the years that followed, simply because one young widow had refused to stop believing in a jar of ash when everyone around her had already stopped believing in her. The lesson Ada Whitfield left behind wasn't really about ash or dust at all. It was about trusting quiet, patient care, even when the whole world insists it's foolish. And sometimes the smallest, most doubted act of faith is the one thing standing between ruin and a harvest nobody thought was possible.